session. I'm Dr. Lynette Holder, Chief Executive Officer of the Small Business Association, and it is my pleasure this morning to welcome you to another in our series of educational sessions, this being our April webinar, as we focus our attention today on the issue of leadership. And we're looking in our webinar today on the impact of leadership on the organization. I'm sure that you will all agree that when John Maxwell posited his view that everything rise or fall on leadership, that he was on to something. And he was sharing a thought with us that the success or lack thereof of the organization, the institution, the country by extension, depend a lot on the level of leadership that is brought to bear on such institutions. And so we understand its significance within the small business sector, within the small business community. And so we thought that this month of April, we will focus our attention on understanding really the essence of leadership. What is considered successful leadership? What is considered ineffective leadership? What do we need to do as managers of our own firms, as leaders across civil society, within our homes, and the community at large? What do we need to do to improve our level of leadership? What do we need to bring to this process? And so I know we're going to have, again, a very exciting, a very informative session. We have with us today Professor C. Justin Robinson, who is the head of the Department of Economics at the University of the West Indies, Cave Hill campus. And he's going to share with us on this critical topic of the impact of leadership on the organization. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with Professor Robinson. He is a national of St. Vincent and the Grenadines and currently serves as head of the Department of Economics, University of the West Indies Cave Hill campus. He obtained his PhD in finance from the University of Manchester, UK, and he also holds Masters of Science in Finance and Econometrics from Florida International University, and BSc in Management Studies, first class honors from the University of the West Indies Cave Hill campus. Professor Robinson's research interests are capital markets in developing countries, public finance, financial risk management, and corporate finance in developing countries. He currently serves as a director of the Central Bank of Barbados and the first vice president of the Barbados Museum and Historical Society. So, ladies and gentlemen, without any further ado, let me introduce to you Dr. Justin Robinson to share with us in this month's webinar as we look at the impact of leadership on the organization. Dr. Robinson?
Okay, good morning, and thank you very much, Lynette, for that warm introduction. And I want to thank the SBA for inviting me. I always look forward, as an academic, I always look forward to sessions with people who actually do stuff and sort of have that interaction between those of us who sit in academia and think about stuff and interacting with persons who do stuff. So I'm going to do a brief presentation on leadership, and to some extent, I will focus on what I think are the key, what I think is the key element in defining successful leadership within organizations. And I focus a lot on organizational culture, because as someone who's had the privilege or the curse of being in leadership positions, what the question I always ask myself, and what I find is the major determinant of success, is the culture I am operating within and the culture that I am shaping and building. And I always encourage leaders to ask themselves that question: what culture am I building within my organization? And does that culture support support and enable the strategy that I'm trying to implement. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through my PowerPoint, and then we hopefully have a good discussion. We do a different share. Oh, yes. So if we get to the start, so I think Lynette covered that to some extent. I think we all agree that leadership does matter. The sort of famous Caribbean philosopher once, C.L.R. James once said, any cook can govern. And we do ask the question, does the captaincy or the coach have that much effect on the performance of the team? And I sort of dodge that question, and I take the importance of leadership as a given. And what I'm going to posit in my presentation is that the major impact of leadership on organizations is through the formulation and implementation of organizational strategy. That is really one of the core differentiators or different roles for a leader, and the role of leadership in shaping and nurturing organizational culture. However, I ultimately argue that the major impact of leadership on an organization comes from its impact on the culture of the organization. And I argue that for two reasons, because culture is a major determinant. And what I think in some ways is more important is that culture by its very nature tends to endure beyond the tenure of a leader. So after the leader has moved on, he or she often leaves a culture that remains in the organization and impacts performance for time to come. So I'll talk a little bit about leadership theories and style briefly. Then I'll transition, and the bulk of the presentation really will be strategy, organizational culture, exploring culture, and that link between strategy, culture, and leadership. So that will sort of be the flow. So academics have spent a lot of time thinking about leadership, and there may be maybe 3 or 4 dominant perspectives. So that's because of the functional theories of leadership, where leaders concerned with the interaction of 3 broad areas: the tasks, setting goals, methods, and processes within the organization. The team, building teams, fostering effective interaction, communication, clarifying roles of persons, building team morale. And then at the individual level, paying attention to the behavior, the feelings of employees, coaching, and so on. So that's a sort of a very functional aspect of leadership. What do leaders do? What are their functions within the organization? And it's really managing or leading the interaction of these 3 areas. Then you sort of have what people call behaviorist theories. So leaders' behaviors and actions, rather than their traits or skills, are really what important. Are they production-oriented? Are they people-oriented? And then different leadership behaviors lead to what we call different leadership styles. So the leader, autocratic, persuasive, consultative, democratic. So there's quite a big body of literature on different leadership styles, the leaders' behaviors and actions, and what are the implications of those leadership styles for organizational success. And there's a consensus to some extent that that approach does not really provide a good guide to effective leadership in different situations. And so the new leadership theory, there's a lot of discussion now about transformational leadership, where the role of the leader is to inspire individuals, develop trust, and encourage creativity and personal growth. So the leader really wants to build that individuals develop a sense of purpose to benefit the organization, goes beyond themselves. And in some ways, maybe what guides a lot of thinking now, the whole idea that leadership is situational or contingency leadership. That there is no good or bad leadership style, that the style should change according to the situation and in response to the individuals being managed, how competent they are, their level of motivation. So if you're in a situation where there's a low level of competence among the employees, low motivation, then you really want something more akin to an authoritarian directive style. On the other extreme, where you have a situation where employees are highly competent, highly motivated, then the leader's role is really to delegate, observe, and so on, and somewhere along that. So the idea then that there is the leadership style should adjust to fit the situation. Now, with that little bit of background, which I think is pretty much standard leadership theory discussion, I then move into what I think is the bulk of my presentation, where I really argue that the distinctive role, function, or the impact of leadership in the organization comes really strategy and culture are among the main tools at the top leaders' disposal as they try to maintain the organization's viability and effectiveness. And strategy offers a formal logic for the company's goals and orients people around them. Whereas culture expresses the goals of the company through values and beliefs and guides activity through shared assumptions and group norms. So in a way, two very different variables. Now, strategy. Strategy provides clarity and focus for collective action and decision making. So you have an organization, many different individuals, things pulling in different directions. Strategy is that unifying mechanism. It is the roadmap. So it provides clarity. It relies on plans and choices to mobilize people. And you can have rewards for achieving goals, consequences for failing to do so. Now, what I argue really is that I think in 2021, leaders in organizations of almost all sizes and types recognize the critical role of strategy. So strategic planning, having your KPIs and so on, mission, vision. I think a lot of that is now part for the course, so to speak. Leaders are very much aware of that. Culture is less well understood than strategy among leaders, the research shows, but no less important, and I tend to argue even more important. So what is culture? And I know in the introduction, Lynette said you have people from around the world, but I guess I'm hearing the phrase a lot in Barbados. The culture is who we are. It's almost who you are as an organization. It's almost that indefinable thing. It's a tacit social order of an organization. What is accepted and not accepted within this organization? What is rewarded and how we do things around here? The cultural norms, they define what is encouraged, discouraged, accepted, or rejected within a group. And this is kind of central to what my message I try to bring today, when this is properly aligned with strategy, it can unleash tremendous amounts of energy towards a shared purpose and foster an organization's capacity to thrive. And the research and experience suggests that it's far more common for leaders seeking to build high-performing organizations to be confounded by culture. And there's this popular phrase, culture eats strategy for breakfast. So leaders and organizations invest a lot of time and effort in their strategic planning. They hire us from the business school, they pay us some money, not a lot. We come up with this plan and it's laid out. But they're often frustrated in their ability to deliver on their strategic plan because they don't understand culture's power and dynamics, and the plans go off the rails. So that notion so part of the reason why I highlight the importance of culture is that there's a lot of evidence now out there that culture eats strategy for breakfast. The strategic plans get thrown off the rail. And what are the features of organization culture? culture is a shared experience. It's not an individual thing. It's something that is the interaction between a group of people. So your strategic plans, your vision, mission statement, and so on might not be shared across your organization, but your organization culture is. It's pervasive. It goes through all levels. The persons in your firm don't need a PowerPoint presentation from the CEO or a communique about the culture of the organization. It's pervasive. It's there. People live it every day. One of the important things, I think, it's enduring, which is why I highlight the importance. Because if something deserves the title of a culture, it's not a fly-by-night flavor of the month issue. It's something that endures. It becomes part of the DNA. And sometimes there's good reasons for that. Persons who don't fit into the culture often leave. When persons are being hired, sometimes companies implicitly, well, will this person fit in here? So culture tends to be quite enduring, and it's implicit. It's sometimes nonverbal cues and so on. Now, decades of academic research suggest that there are two broad dimensions to a firm's culture. One, the way people interact within the organization or the firm. And two, their response to change. How does the organization instinctively react to change? So on the one card, so on terms of people interactions, the academic research tends to identify two broad spectrums. Some cultures are highly independent, while others are highly interdependent. Independent cultures tend to favor autonomy of persons, individual action, and competition. Independent cultures tend to favor integration. Interdependent cultures, sorry. There's a focus on managing relationships and coordinating group effort. People in such cultures tend to collaborate and see organizational success through the lens of the group. We succeeded. In an independent culture, it's I succeeded. The success is mine. Whereas in interdependent cultures, it's rarely very much a we, and they see organizational success through the lens of the group. And then on the other dimension, how does the organization respond to change? Some cultures emphasize stability, consistency, predictability, and maintaining the status quo. Is the instinctive, pervasive, enduring instinct of some companies, while others emphasize flexibility, adaptability, and receptiveness to change. So cultures that favor stability tend to follow rules. Promotion and others tend to be based on seniority. You tend to reinforce hierarchy. What's the chain of command, and strive for efficiency. Whereas cultures that favor flexibility tend to prioritize innovation, openness, diversity, and a long-term orientation. And central to my argument, my main argument today, is that leaders who don't understand their current organizational culture and how it fits with their strategic direction are doomed to failure. Culture aligned with strategy can release a lot of energy that can drive organizational success. And even if a charismatic, dominant leader is able to drive a strategy through, if that strategy does not become aligned to the culture of the organization, then that success is short-lived. As that leader moves on, that strategic approach did not become part of the DNA, and the organization does not have the culture to sustain it. So in the literature, which is sort of the state of the art, how we sort of think of culture and the implications for its alignment with strategy and leadership, academics tend to identify these 8 cultural dimensions, depending on where an organization falls on the flexibility, stability, independence, interdependence quadrant. So where you have a culture that is high on interdependence, relatively high on stability. We might classify that as a caring culture, results-oriented culture. And I will quickly do a brief definition of these 8 cultural dimensions that are widely recommended to companies. That if you're trying to understand your culture, this is a framework that can be used to define and measure your organizational culture so that you're aware where you are, what culture suits my strategy. So what's my current culture? What's my aspirational culture given my strategic trust? And how might I move there? So these 8 styles can be used to diagnose and describe highly complex and diverse behavioral patterns in a culture, and to model how likely an individual leader is to align with and shape that culture. Now, and none is inherently better or worse, really by the relative strength. And I've put a little link in the chat with a little survey if persons care to take, where we can have a sense. You don't have to reveal yourself, but we can have a sense as to where persons on the webinar fall along these dimensions. So if persons can take that, I will share. If people can complete that link, I can share that at the end of the webinar. So the framework can be used to diagnose your organizational culture and the implications for strategy effectiveness. So these are already the 8 cultural types that we tend to work with: caring, purpose, learning, enjoyment, results, authority, safety, and order. And I did share the PowerPoint so persons can sort of read some of that. So caring cultures focus on relationships and mutual trust. The work environments are warm, collaborative, and welcoming places where employees help and support one another. So employees are united by loyalty. And leaders in that environment tend to emphasize sincerity, teamwork, and positive relationships. And this seems to be the second most dominant cultural style that we identify. So there's an ongoing global survey around this coming out of INSEAD University. And about 63% of organizations, their cultural, again, they've done the survey similar to what I put in the link there, the chat there. And about 63% of organizations are strong on having a caring type of culture. A purpose-driven culture, exemplified by altruism and idealism. You know, the work environments are tolerant, compassionate places where people try to do their best for the long-term good of the world. So employees are unified by a focus on sustainability and global communities. And the leaders emphasize sharing ideals, contributing to a greater cause. We are trying to change the world. What we are doing is for some greater good. Not that pervasive a style, only about 9% of organizations seem to fall in that bucket. Learning cultures, exploration, expansiveness, and creativity. Work environments are inventive, open-minded places. Employees are unified by curiosity. The leaders emphasize innovation, knowledge, and adventure. And somewhat worrying for academics, this doesn't appear to be a very pervasive style, 7%, because there tends to be a sense that if the environment is one characterized by rapid change, then a learning culture becomes quite critical for successful organizations. But not many organizations are really scoring in this bucket. Enjoyment cultures, maybe as expected, score pretty low. Workplaces are not exactly places of fun all the time. And by a long way, the most dominant culture is a results-oriented culture. It's characterized by achievement and winning. Workplaces are outcome-oriented, merit-driven places where people aspire to achieve top performance. So employees are united by this drive for capability and success, and leaders emphasize goal accomplishment. And in a way, I think that is linked to the rise and the dominance of strategic planning. Organizations now, everyone has their strat plan. You have your KPIs, you have your performance evaluation. So that results orientation is critical. And we have authority-based cultures, safety-based cultures, and order. Culture emphasizes order. Order still 15% of firms still have it strong. Focus on respect, structure, and shared norms. Workplaces are methodical places where people follow the rules and they want to fit in. Leaders emphasize shared procedures and time-honored customs. This is how we have always done it. This is how you do it here. So again, just remind, so again, we have these 8 dimensions and organizations fall somewhere along that. And I highlight the results and the caring as they are the 2 most pervasive. Achievement-driven, goal focus. The advantages of a result style is there's improved execution, there's a focus on the market, goal achievement. However, the disadvantage is it may lead to communication and collaboration breakdowns and higher levels of stress and anxiety within the organization. And the second most commonly the cultural style we see is the caring, where it's warm, sincere, relational. That does lead to improved teamwork, high levels of employee engagement, good communication, high levels of trust, and a sense of belonging. The downside that is commonly seen is that there's the overemphasis on consensus building may reduce exploration of options. It might stifle competitiveness and decision-making can be slow. Now, the spatial dimensions are important. So if you look at the graph, styles such as safety and order, or learning and enjoyment, which are close to learning on the graph, will coexist more easily than styles that are far apart, such as authority and purpose or safety and learning. So it's difficult to combine authority culture with a learning culture. Achieving a culture of authority often means gaining the advantages and living with the disadvantages of that culture, but missing out on the advantages and avoiding the disadvantage of, say, a culture of purpose. So some of these cultural styles seem to have difficulty coexisting together, and the spatial dimensions on the graph, on the framework, sort of give you that sense. Now, inherent in the framework are fundamental trade-offs. Although each style can be beneficial, natural constraints and competing demands force difficult choices about which values to emphasize and how people are expected to behave. What culture are you trying to promote? It is common to find organizations, and this is where leadership breaks down, what not to do is where the culture emphasizes both results and caring. But this combination can be confusing for employees. Are they expected to optimize individual goals and strive for outcomes at all costs? Or should they work as a team and emphasize collaboration and shared success? Now, the nature of the work itself may make it difficult for employees to be equally results focused and caring. Now, in contrast, a culture that emphasizes caring and order encourages a work environment in which teamwork, trust, and respect are paramount. The 2 styles are mutually reinforcing, which can be beneficial, but can also present challenges. So there's a trade-off. You have to make a choice. The benefits of a culture that emphasizes caring and order, the research shows you have strong levels of employee loyalty. You tend to retain your talent, lack of conflict within the organization, and high levels of engagement. The challenges with that combination, however, is a tendency towards groupthink, a reliance on consensus-based decisions, sometimes an avoidance of difficult issues, and a sense of us versus them. So something arises and you close ranks. The thin blue, some people talk about the blue line, the organization close ranks. Leaders who are more focused on results and learning may find the combination of caring and order stifling when they seek to drive entrepreneurship and change. So tying it all together here, so using this framework, managers or leaders can understand their organization's culture and assess its intended and unintended effects. You can evaluate the level of consistency in employees' view of the culture. Identify subcultures within your organization that may account for higher or lower group performance. Pinpoint differences between legacy cultures doing mergers and acquisitions. That merger and acquisitions are a major part of growth. And the results show again that in merger and acquisitions, we tend to spend a lot of time on the finance stuff and the IT stuff and getting the numbers right. But what almost always determines the success of that merger acquisition is what people somewhat disparagingly call the softer issues, but the culture fit. There's a well-known merger of a bank in Barbados. And for a long time, whenever I walked into that bank and I interacted with people, I could tell which of the legacy companies they came from. And again, that's the notion that that culture is enduring. It can also be important in terms of to be able to rapidly orient new executives to the culture they are joining and help them determine the most effective way to lead employees, measure the degree of alignment between individual leadership styles and organizational culture to determine what impact a leader might have. And also to design an aspirational culture and communicate the changes necessary to achieve it. When aligned with strategy and leadership, a strong culture drives positive organizational performance. The strategy culture alignment should play a crucial role in leadership development and selection. In a dynamic, uncertain environment in which organizations must be more agile, learning cultures become more important. And a strong culture can be a significant liability when it is misaligned with your strategy. Unlike developing and executing a business plan, changing a company's culture is inextricable from the emotional and social dynamics of people in the organization. And the research finds that there are 4 practices in particular that lead to successful culture change and alignment. One, you want to articulate the aspiration. Where do you want to take the organization? You want to select and develop leaders who align with the target culture. So quite often in recruitment, someone comes in with a wonderful CV, they've had great success, they do a wow interview, and you want to hire that person. But if that leader is going to be successful, a key issue is what is the culture fit? Is this leader going to be effective? So will a charismatic leader work well in a culture that is built around order and safety? If that is your culture, if you're bringing in a leader like that, then you need quite a change management strategy because you're introducing a level of tension. You want to use organizational conversations about culture to underscore the importance of change. And then you want to reinforce the desired change through how the organization is defined. And in closing, I guess I come back to where I started. I think leaders ultimately impact their organization through the strategies they adopt and the organization culture that their styles and attributes create, which endures beyond their tenure. I argue that leaders have positive impacts on their organizations when their styles and attributes are such that they're able to adapt the strategic direction to the needs of the organization. And I think even more importantly, they foster cultures that promote long-term organizational success long after their tenure. And I think if you're going to have success beyond the tenure of a particular leadership, a lot of it will depend on what type of culture you are building. All right, thank you very much. I will open up for any questions, queries, comments, discussion.
Thank you very much, Dr. Robinson. I believe that we can begin our discussion really on the last point that you made, recognizing that culture eats strategy for lunch, and the success of the organization really is dependent more so on the culture of the entity than strategy. For all of us on the call, the $1 million question, therefore, is how do you really influence culture? How do you, as a leader, in a very pragmatic way, how do you, as a leader, develop the kind of culture in the organization that you need to be able to take your organization forward and help you to roll out your strategy?
Okay, so it's a very good question, tough question. And in some ways, the core of my presentation, I say, first of all, is what I think is a big hurdle for a lot of leaders is to recognize that this is important. Leaders tend to focus a lot on strategy. They see culture as this sort of namby-pamby, touchy-feely thing. You leave it for the HR department. And then they get quite frustrated when their wonderful strategies, which they are convinced will take the organization to the level it needs to be, are frustrated. So I think the first step is to recognize the critical nature of culture. Okay, I mean, it sounds simplistic, but culture is who you are. It's how people react instinctively to things within the organization. So I think one, recognize the importance. Two, you don't have to buy my framework or that framework, but to have a framework, something like that, where you actually try to diagnose and understand where you are culturally. I think that's a critical step. Do the mapping, try to have some understanding. What is my organizational culture? Because it doesn't make sense say that I'm going to have a culture, that my strategy is built around entrepreneurial activity and innovation, when your culture in your organization, what we may call a culture of safety and order. People, instead, that's what they instinctively do. So you need to understand your culture. Now, if the culture doesn't fit with where you want to go strategically, you now then need to have a change management strategy. How do I articulate this culture? What are my rewards? So for example, we have a lot of discussion around the performance of the civil service. But if you think, what's the culture of the civil service? The very nature of the civil service is you try to write a procedures manual to anticipate each and every problem. So when a situation arises that the rules didn't anticipate, that culture always seeks to impose order on it. So once that culture remains, and then that culture is reinforced by the whole rewards and punishment. So if you go into a government department and you get good service, is that employee rewarded? What might matter in that org and the culture is, but if you make a mistake, if you breach a procedure, which goes on your file, you might face a significant penalty. So some of the behaviors we see are quite natural. You go in and you understand, you follow that rule book. That's the culture in here. Why are you trying to do something outside the rule book? So I think in answering your question, I say one, don't see culture as something that them people in the HR department do, and I don't have to worry about it. It's a critical thing. Try to map the culture and understand what the culture is. And importantly, you're not mapping it for its own sake. How does it fit with the strategy I'm trying to execute? So you either then have to change your strategy or try to change the culture.
Quite agree with you that it is not to be left to the HR department at all. The organization's culture is influenced from the top. So that CEO, managing director, owner, proprietor it's going to influence to a large extent the overall culture of the organization. It's ironic you mentioned that commercial bank, and as soon as you gave that example, he smiled, because I'm sure that everyone on the call can easily identify, without calling any names,
Yep.
which bank it was.
Yes,
and the fact that you can easily, from relating to the officers in that bank, identify which of the two brands a particular officer may have identified with, based on how they interacted with the consumer. But interesting. I have the questions flowing in, so I have to go now to the chat to share with us what our colleagues are asking. Let's start with Dwight. Dwight is asking, how can small and medium enterprises implement a strategic approach to succession planning to ensure their businesses' long-term survival and success?
Okay, so again, now one of the key roles of leadership and their impact on the org, and I said we kind of have to accept, and sometimes your tenure as a leader is going to be finite. You could die, you could retire, you could move on. So your tenure as a leader is going to be finite. So what happens after you move on is critical. So succession planning is quite critical. And I think small enterprises quite often can have very strong cultures, mainly because of their small size. Employees tend to have been around for a long time. The owner founder is often around. That person's personality and values tend to pervade. So small organizations, tend to have quite strong cultures. And in terms of your succession planning, and it goes back to my earlier answer, where is this organization going to go? What is the strategic direction? If your strategy is going to remain as is, then it's critical that in identifying the future leaders, that they are a good cultural fit. You don't just want to look at their qualifications and their experience and how successful they have been in other organizations, but do they fit the culture? If, however, in the succession, you see a need to change strategy. So maybe as you are moving from a small organization to medium size, maybe you now need to have some more order, because sometimes there's a way in which we tend to see the styles as inferior. But as you are transitioning from, say, small to medium size, there might be a need to build a culture more around order. So in your succession planning, you would want to identify leaders who can lead that change. So again, the cultural fit would be key to that succession plan.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, as the organization moves from sometimes being very informal, they become formalized, and they move from being micro and they start to grow.
Yes.
It's important now to document, and I think that's been a challenge for many MSMEs, to be able now to document systems and processes and so on, because a lot of that tacit information is with the owner, is with the founder. So to be able now to put structure and systems in place to facilitate the growth and succession of the firm, then becomes very, very, very critical. Quite agree. Here's Julian.
And that's an important point, because I want to emphasize that, because there's a way in which, when persons are exposed to these constructs, maybe sometimes words communicate things, so people gravitate towards cultural styles and like caring and others. And I emphasize, it's not that one is better than the other. So given the industry you're in, the nature of competition, your size, where you're transitioning to, a particular cultural style might be much better suited for you at that juncture. So again, moving from micro to small, you really might now need to be standardizing your processes, bringing some order into it. So order should not be seen as a negative.
Quite agree. You need to emphasize that some more. I took note that 89% of the firms in the survey had that results-oriented culture, versus 63 or so percent, I think it was, that was more caring. And this takes me to Julian's question, because Julian is here asking, what impact does societal culture now have on an organizational culture based on your research? And because it is said that in the Caribbean, we tend to be more a caring culture than a results oriented culture.
That's an excellent question, and that's a question that really occupies a lot of our time, me and some of my colleagues at UWI, in terms of how we think about culture and driving success in our organizations. Now, the society has certain cultural traits which will tend to bias employees towards, and by extension, leaders and organization to a particular cultural style. And in the region, towards more caring, cooperation, small societies, everyone knows each other. But one of the modifiers in there, though, is really globalization, regionalization, and competition, which is why I think the results orientation is so dominant, in that it can be difficult in a competitive environment. It can be extremely difficult to survive and prosper as an organization if you don't have a results orientation. I think that's what accounts for that large. So, whatever your preferences of your culture, the very nature of a competitive business landscape, and we no longer have, you can almost no longer operate your company within a set of borders where you're protected from international competition. So I think that largely explains why that results orientation is so dominant. And the challenge for organizations in parts of the Caribbean, how do we balance that results orientation? How do we achieve it while catering to our various cultural norms, which tend to focus more around caring? There's also quite what our research shows, that there's quite a lot of desire for order in the region, in the Caribbean countries. People love some bureaucracy. That's something we find, that they always want to write a bigger rule book, stepping out. So while there's a lot of talk about creativity, there's a high level of discomfort when persons step away from the true and beaten path. There's a strong orientation towards charismatic leaders. So again, that authority figure, laying out a strategy, imposing order, is something we see that tend to be quite dominant. So, I guess we don't like it to some extent, but the reality is that in a lot of our organizations, what employees seem to gravitate towards is the benevolent dictator who exhibits caring for the flock, but is very much, for want of a better term, large and in charge, the authority figure, imposing order, and so on. Now, the challenge with that tends to come with the longevity issue. Okay, because that leader inevitably moves on, and then the organization seems to falter until another leader of that type pops up. So that is often one of the challenges we tend to see, even at the level of the firm, where that charismatic, and there's a lot of research, a lot of discussion now around charismatic, some people call it narcissistic leadership. I guess a lot of that is driven by the occupancy of a certain person in the White House in the US, where a lot of this knowledge comes from. But also, a lot of the CEOs around now are quite dominant characters, the Elon Musk and others. They really are personalities that dominate. And they can, and there's a tension in the literature where I think a lot of academics and persons instinctively have reservations about that dominant, charismatic leader, even narcissistic, but they seem to be quite critical leaders and important leaders at moments of crisis and significant change in taking persons along. The downside people often point is, beside the longevity, is the impact within the organization, where, and I think the phrase that sticks in my head, people say that those leaders claim they want teamwork, but what they really want is a group of yes men. You know, and that can have quite an impact, because if you build a culture of sycophancy, then that affects the organization effort as well.
But you know, which comes first, the chicken or the egg? Because
Yes.
it is a case when you look across the society, somehow based on those theories, our society tends to gravitate to those kinds of leaders. Is that, you know, if you even as you're speaking, I'm thinking even in our political arena, you look across, if your chief politician is not that charismatic personality, you'll find that people tend to dismiss them all. That individual is not an effective leader, irrespective of how they're able to produce. So, you know, which
And
comes
those
first?
leaders can be quite high performing and effective. So when we look at outcomes, I don't necessarily want to view it, I don't view it as a negative. Because sometimes in literature and in popular language, people see it as negative, but the evidence is that those can be quite high performing, productive, effective leaders, and no one style is better or worse than the other. That's the whole notion of situational leadership. What does the situation require? I said the challenge with those leadership styles tend to be the longevity. Mm-hmm. That when that leader moves on, the business seems to flounder. So when Elon Musk moves on, you know, will Tesla be the same? How much of it is just him? Has he built something for the future?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You know, Apple after Steve Jobs, can they continue? And that really seems to be the challenge with that particular style of leadership.
Mm-hmm. All right, here's Jeffrey asking a rather interesting question. Can you speak briefly to the importance of having culture advocates in the organization?
Okay, so again, I think that's extremely important. So many organizations, when you have a strategic plan, you have your KPIs, and then you sort of identify champions. You know, there's a quality champion. These are persons, and given the importance I am elevating culture to, then cultural advocates are extremely important. And one of the things that research shows a lot is leaders is the perception leaders have of the culture of the organization and the perception the employees have can be quite far apart. And one of the key roles of the cultural advocates is really to bridge that gap if you are trying to build a culture. So again, for me, as like a head of department, a director of a board, the question I always come back to, what kind of culture am I building? What kind of culture are we building? And does this culture help the organization achieve its objective? Because at the end of the day, it is about the institution. So I think cultural advocates are extremely critical if you are to have that alignment between culture and strategy so that one doesn't eat the other. And in particular, culture is the bigger fella. He's going to swallow up your culture.
Yeah, he's going to swallow up the strategy.
Yep, yes.
Yeah, okay. Laura is asking, how does one plan for legacy in leadership? Which is the best leadership style to encourage legacy leadership?
Well, I will start by saying the charismatic narcissistic tends to be the worst for legacy. Because again, by the very nature of the style and the personality, the stage is not shared. However, in terms of continuity and having legacy leadership, then styles built around order and safety tend to be the styles that really promote that, because in a sense, that maybe fits into a way what C.L.R. James talked about. He said, any cook can govern. There is a playbook for the leader. Independent of the leader's personality, there are a set of rules and procedures and the way we do things that a person can come in as just the guardian of that way. Whereas not everybody can be that transformation charismatic leader. There's a way in which either you have it or you don't.
Really? That's interesting. So you can't learn it then, you're saying?
Well, that's not the evidence. The evidence is it's not some. No, sometimes persons can start out, and as they grow in confidence, they can become quite impactful. But in terms of how people define that charismatic type of leader, that almost goes back to what people, the early theories of leadership, where you talk about traits, that a leader is someone who has
yes.
certain traits. Going back to that trait theory.
But this takes me to Dolores's question now. Is a leader's personality critical to the leadership style or culture? Do organizations, or should organizations really pay attention to the personality of new hires?
Yes, and I think that kind of follows logically from my thesis, that I think assessing employees and leaders for their cultural fit, I think, is often a missing element and leads to quite a lot of frustration for both the organization and the employee, because sometimes you simply don't fit in. There are certain vacancies that come up in my organization that I simply would not apply for because I don't think I would be a good fit.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think that personality style and how it fits with the culture now, or the aspirational culture, I think that's a key missing element in hiring practice. We tend to go for persons with CVs, how they interview, and so on. But an excellent person may not fit in well with a particular leadership style. People thrive differently in different cultural settings. So I think that fit is critical.
Yeah, I want to weigh in on that and agree and say to Dolores, I support the view that you should, as much as possible, have some sort of personality assessment in your recruitment process. It is critical that you have a sense of the personality type and the trait of the individuals being hired or even being interviewed. The fact is that some personality types are just not suited for some positions, and unless you have that assessment built into your interview process, you're unable to make that determination. And it goes across all types of institutions. It could be the church, your community-based organization, your firm, etc. So there is some support for personality types being suited for certain positions. So let's take the last question here from Dennis. Dennis is asking, and I suspect that he wants Dr. Robinson to get a very detailed response from you on this one. How do you build from a one-man organization into a bigger business? What are the steps that you should take?
Oh, that's a big one. Okay, so starting from a one man. So I think one critical and is the question focusing mainly on how your leadership changes from a one man to a bigger? Is that
yes, within the context of leadership, I would interpret it that way.
Yes,
within the context of leadership.
Right. So at that transition stage, and again, which I think is so important that we don't make the common, I don't want to say error, but viewing some of the styles as being more or less positive than each other. But as you move from that tiny and you begin to move up the scale, I tend to take the view that having some order becomes an important. Because when you are the one man, everything is in your head. You know everything. You're having meetings with yourself or in your own mind. Now you have to rely and delegate and work with other people. And one of the first steps, I think, as you begin to move is to have that degree of order and begin to build some structures, some procedures, some basic stuff in there.
Yeah.
Now,
sorry.
No, and the other aspect is, and it goes to one of the earlier questions, huh? There are aspects of global culture that seem to impact on all organizations, which creates pressures on all organizations, whatever their size, whatever their sector, wherever they are, to really exhibit a degree of caring. Huh? So in a way that you can't run a private business successfully without having a results orientation. If you're operating in the 21st century, there's almost a caring requirement that is coming along there. So as you build out that order and authority, it is absolutely critical in today's world that the organization builds that culture of caring. It's almost becoming like a basic requirement. I mean, 40 years ago, the idea that the company cared about you, it's probably more of a contract. You come to work, you're happy to have a job, you get paid, etc., etc. But I guess the workplace is such a critical part of people's life now. You spend so much time there. So that aspect of caring and so on becomes a lot more critical. So persons moving up the scale now have a much bigger challenge because they have to really balance a lot more competing demands. So even persons working in a small business now expect caring. It's not just a results orientation, and you are now required also to build out, things like order and so on. I hope I've answered your question.
That is a challenge. Yeah, that is a challenge. This is why we recommend that small firms need to subscribe to continuous training and education, continuous development, because it is an ongoing process to be able to grow that firm from the one person, the sole proprietor, to now begin to hire employees, and to build out a structure, to have a board of directors established, and to grow that operation. And as you rightly said, more often than not, we know this, the ideas and the practices and so on are in the minds of the owners, those who would have started the business. And to be able now to transition that, you need that order, you need structure. And many times people see it as a negative and not as a positive. So we do promote this as a continuous educational activity. I think it was a total quality management concept. We don't hear about total quality management anymore, but one of the key principles there was continuous education, continuous training, and that is key.
And absolutely critical for small, medium-sized enterprises to really begin to build that longevity, that order aspect, I think is quite critical.
Okay.
When companies get bigger, in some ways, after they've been around for a while, the order can become a bit, in a sense, I guess I'm kind of using some economic concepts here, but maybe the whole notion of diminishing returns, that there's a point beyond which, as you try to build more order, it can become really counterproductive and stifling of creativity.
Yes.
And so on. Many organizations are still at an embryonic stage in that and haven't really maximized in terms of the benefits to be gotten from bringing some order and establishing authority structures.
Yeah, I just realized, Dr. Robinson, Julian had asked a follow-up question, if you would permit me.
Yeah, that's fine.
This is now related to the civil service comment that you had made earlier. He's suggesting that there's a culture of comfort and perception that management acts oftentimes in bad faith in the civil service. So what is really the best approach to leadership in such an environment? And this is the civil service he's talking about.
Yeah. So again, I would argue that in terms of like a civil servant, I think one of the critical steps is to begin to define what is the mission, what is the purpose of the civil service. Because some persons argue that civil service structure, so for example, we hear a lot about business facilitation. In a lot of ways, persons would argue that the structures and key parts of the culture of the civil service, they were never set up to facilitate anything. They were really set up in some ways to block, to have control. That was never, so it's almost like if you have a system of government and you have the politicians wanting to race off in one direction, and the civil service is supposed to act as a restraint on that. And in some ways, some people argue that the British type civil service was actually built for that function. Its role was not really to facilitate and drive anybody's program through to completion. It was actually designed as a restraining mechanism to hold people in check. So I think some of the tensions really come from that. Also, the civil service kind of represents, in some ways, the worst aspects of that famous sociology, Max Weber, the notion of bureaucracy, where they're really rules-based. Now, if you're gonna be rules-based, it almost implies that you can anticipate the situations that are gonna come before you, and you can write a set of rules and regulations as to how to deal with those situations. When you're in an environment of rapid change or unusual circumstances arising, then that rules-based environment really begins to struggle, because you're now confronting scenario situations that the rules never anticipated. And you have an environment that doesn't actually encourage or was not set up to deal. It's almost like making a person a machine. The idea of a civil service is a machine. Anybody could do it. You bring the person in, and there are these rules, processes, procedures that you learn the manual and you just do it. But where you're confronted with uncertainty and rapid change. So I think the civil service, one, what is the function? If the function is a restraining function to slow things down, to force people to rethink things and so on, then in many ways it's doing what it's supposed to do. Okay. Yeah. If we see it, however, as facilitation, and that's why systems need to evolve. So what you tend to have, to some extent, even the UK has gone there, the US, is that like a political administration, you sort of bring in your own team whose job is to drive your program. And they come and go with the political administration, recognizing that the traditional civil service is not designed for that. And that can be quite effective in driving an agenda and getting accomplishments. The traditional civil service gives you consistency, predictability, reliability, and if that's what you're looking for, that's what the traditional system here is giving you. So I think the right approach is, what do you want out of the civil service? Right. Now, I think one of our challenges is that we have tended to go down the road of the statutory corporations. And in a way, I think we've ended up with the worst of both worlds, where I think you've lost the rules, you've lost the rules, the predictability, and the controls of the traditional public service without actually gaining the market discipline and results orientation of the private sector. You kind of end up with something in between that is not bound by the rules of the public service, but is also not quite subject to the market discipline of a private sector.
Very good. Very good. I actually enjoy that analysis there. You're so right. What really is the civil service intended or designed to do? And actually, as you spoke, my mind went back to that one of my favorite British sitcoms, Yes, Minister.
Yes, we all remember that very well.
Yes, Minister. You know, that's a good example of what the role that the civil service played. But the thing is that in this 21st century environment, now we expect our civil service to be more innovative and creative and so on, but it was not designed that way. So there's a whole transformation process that is required. Okay. Finally, I'm going to ask, has the university worked on any models for guiding cultural integration in mergers and acquisitions?
Yes, so we have Yeah, so we have some good work on that, and maybe a future webinar, you could maybe invite my colleagues, Professor Devonish, Dwayne Devonish, Dion Greenwich. They've done quite a bit of work in that sphere.
Yeah. Okay.
And good work as well, good relevant work.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, Dolores wanted to know that as well. So thanks for sharing. Well, colleagues, I am not sure if you had a chance to complete the survey. Dr. Robinson, did you get any responses to the survey?
Yes. Yeah. Let me check there now.
The link was sent. The link was put in the chat. Let me remind those on the call now, please to go to the chat section on the Zoom platform and complete a very short feedback tool we have there. Very, very short. Won't take you 5 minutes to do so. The intention, as I said at the beginning, is to help us to evaluate our programs as we go forward. Any response? If you have not yet done so.
Yes, no. So quite good response, and the responses are.
Okay, if you want to share with us before we wrap
yes,
up.
So before we wind up,
Mm-hmm.
What we are seeing, what I'm seeing from the responses here is our single highest area of response is in the area of planning and caution, which is suggesting that in terms of the cultural dimension, safety is the strongest dimension showing up among our respondents here today so far.
Safety.
Yeah, so that's quite interesting. Safety, strength, and boldness is next in line. And then compassion and tolerance. So again, fitting into that whole caring notion. So quite interesting, quite interesting.
But is that as a researcher, is that conditioned by the environment that we're in?
Yes,
at this point in time, safety is a major issue with COVID-19. Yes. Now we have the impact of the ash from the volcano. So, how do you treat to that as a researcher? Because that is really time specific.
But also, there's a lot of evidence that we like things well organized. That's a term currently people like to use. We have a strong liking for some structure and organization, what are the rules, what are the guidelines, give them to me so that I know what is going on. So that high safety score is quite consistent with what we tend to see within the Caribbean culture, where we tend to place quite a high premium on structure and organization. People come to a meeting, they want to see the agenda, a well laid out agenda. It's not supposed to be any sort of rambling discussion. One of the most difficult things to organize in like a brainstorming session, like what am I supposed to do? Just brainstorm. We tend to like that structure and so on. So quite fascinating.
Yeah, you're so right. The people that will tell you they can't come to the meeting if you don't see an agenda first.
Yeah, no, and you have to see, and you're supposed to follow it.
Yeah, that's right.
And then
I raised my hand up because I tend to be like that too.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, we're all part of the culture.
Yeah. All right. Anyhow, thanks so much. Ladies and gentlemen, you've been listening to Professor Dr. Justin Robinson, who is the head of the Department of Economics, UWI Cave-Hill campus. And we've been having a very interesting discussion on the impact of leadership on the organization.